David, you and I have both been fascinated by the nature of mind and consciousness. I want to ask you, from your perspective as a strong theist, what is the nature of human mind?
Well, it depends on which question we're asking. What is the nature of my individual experience of being a conscious self with its psychological limitations? That's mysterious enough. Where it touches on the question of God, of theism, are in the conditions that make it possible, despite the seeming impossibility of those conditions being the product of a finite physical source. So, I mean, if a good phenomenology of consciousness reveals that there's a unified field of apperception or of apprehension that seems to participate in a simplicity that can't be grounded in a composite physical system. Or if consciousness in its natural intentionality, which I believe is true, is oriented irreducibly towards transcendental ends that can't be contained within empirical nature. Let's just say the good, the true, and the beautiful is shorthand, but I don't want to make that sound like a systematic catalog, but an inventory of God. But that the very act of consciousness itself looks like my finite participation in an act that far exceeds my finite identity. I'm very influenced by certain figures within the various traditions, Maximus the Confessor in Christian thought, and Gregory of Nyssa, but also Proclus in pagan thought, Ramanuja in Vedanta, Ibn Arabi and others, all of whom, to a greater or lesser degree, would say that the act of consciousness is nothing less than a finite participation in the infinite act of divine consciousness, which is the constitution of reality, that its sources and its ends exceed the finite conditions of an ego, and that what I am as a psychological self or as a particular organism is something that takes shape in the interval between a pure origin and a pure end, so to speak.
If I give you that, the question is, how does that work?
How does it work?
How does it work? Do you need a spirit? Is there some spirit that is implanted in us, or is there some natural soul that some people would call immortal? It's nice to say, and I'd like to believe it, and maybe I sort of do believe it, but how would it work? And if you can't explain how it would work, I mean, ultimately.
Well, I mean, when you say how would it work, I mean, what are the mechanics of consciousness?
Mechanics is a pejorative word,
Yeah.
but it
has
to happen. It has to happen.
Sure, I mean,
it's not going to happen. I mean, because there's some Eastern thought that would just have our consciousness. That consciousness is the only reality, and our consciousness is part of the cosmic consciousness, and it's just a sharing of that.
You do understand that's kind of a vague description of Eastern thought too. When you actually get into the schools of say, Vedanta, which would be the most rigorous philosophical tradition from the 8th century CE onward in Hindu thought. None of them just sort of dissolve into a vague sense of cosmic consciousness. They make a rigorous distinction between Atman as the direct presence of the divine within us, which is that spiritual intellectual capacity that has that intentional end, and Jiva, in its more particularistic sense of this soul, which participates in that spiritual reality. But I mean, it's not, the Eastern traditions are every bit as rigorous and articulated as the Western in this regard. And they're not offering a picture of how it works. They're saying that the prior reality is spiritual consciousness. That's the ground, that is the ontological ground of all that is. everything that takes shape in the form of a finite intentional phenomenon, even my empirical ego, even my psychological self, is a product of that reality and participates in it. All of these traditions, all the classical theistic traditions, are traditions of participation. That is, that God is not some separated agent over there, but is the fullness of a reality in which I graciously take part, both ontologically and spiritually, if you like.
That sounds more Eastern to me, whereas in the Western Christian tradition, it's more of an implantation. I don't want a soul.
No, I mean, forgive me, but what Christian tradition are we talking about? Because if you actually look, you'll get language of the infusion of a rational soul in the body. Well, you get language of the jiva entering the body in Hinduism as well. That's not problematic because they believe that these are two aspects of a single participation in a divine reality that encompasses both and transcends what we can say of either.
So the Christian tradition
but
is
Christian
what?
tradition has, again, as I say, with Maximus and others, it is also an ontology of participation. Our spiritual nature is a participation, however deferred, diminished, refracted, prismated, whatever you want to say, of God's knowledge of himself and his eternal being. That's firmly stated by the Cappadocian Fathers, by Augustine, by Maximus. Now, how they understand the nature of that relation of the created to its creator, there may be greater emphasis on language of causality in one tradition than in another, but the model of participation is hardly unique to the East. It's very much part of the Christian intellectual tradition.
What's the articulation between this participation and a soul, an immortal soul, which we commonly associate with a Christian thought?
Again, though, what do you mean by soul? I mean, in Thomas Aquinas, it's the form of the body which is individuated by the material substrate. He's an Aristotelian.
Right.
If you go back to, in the West, Augustine, or in the East, the Cappadocian Fathers, there's a greater emphasis.
So you're very early in the traditions. How about later? How about in recent centuries?
It's taken many different forms. I mean, the great 20th century Christian philosophers and theologians like Bernard Lonergan, who are concerned only with speaking of it as an act of spiritual intelligence. There's not a physics of the soul. Insofar as we have psyche, if that's what you mean by soul, that is a principle of life, which is also a principle of organization, which also allows for, in rational creatures, a union between the highest intellective capacity all the way down to the simplest sense experiences. The soul isn't a Cartesian soul. I mean, nowhere in Christian thought do you have the notion of the soul as just a detached essence that then inhabits a body. The body itself is seen as being you find this quite often in, say, Plotinus, but also a phrase you find in Christian writers: the body is in the soul, not the soul is in the body. The soul is that whole formal intellectual act of being that is our participation in the infinite act of being that is God. But if you're talking about a simple Cartesian substance inhabiting a machine, that's a post-Christian picture. Even though Descartes was confessionally Christian, that's not the classical Christian picture of the soul.